Oregon may be thinking college football playoff, but USC can still certainly think Pac-12 championship here in 2019. Mark Rogers TV, the voice of college football, talking USC, talking Oregon as the two meet at the Coliseum coming up this weekend. We got Matt Lowery on the line, who joins us on a regular basis from Conquest Chronicles on SB Nation's platform for USC athletics. Hey, Matt, how you doing today?
Doing pretty good, Mark. Just ready for this coming weekend's game, and then got a few interesting things that's actually coming up for the weekend and through the week. So I'm looking forward to it. How are you doing?
I'm doing great. I look forward to this matchup after taking in some of the Oregon Washington State game in which the Ducks had to hang on and score late to win that game. And of course, USC had a similar situation with Colorado that was a bit dicey on the road in Boulder, but they finally pick up a road win here in 2019 before we actually hit November. So before we move on to the matchup against the Ducks, your thoughts about USC surviving and scoring late to knock off Colorado?
I had a chance to look at the game. I had a chance to rewatch it, and honestly, it wasn't as bad as I thought, as many people made it out to be. Though I felt USC defensively took a step back. And I mean, you could say, well, there's a lot of injuries from last week's game. They're missing some key players, but that didn't stop them against Arizona. And Arizona is is rated as one of the best offenses in the Pac-12. So really, to me, I felt the defense took a step back. They had issues tackling, had containment issues, and let Steven Montez, extend plays and scramble all over him after containing Khalil Tate. I think one thing for sure though is that the USC wide receiving group, we said that it was a one of the top receiving cores in the nation. They certainly showed it time in and time out. Keaton Slovis also showed his resiliency by working through the freshman mistakes and the freshman moments that we tend to see. And he delivered when the team needed it the most, also going with Michael Pittman Jr., who's been very reliable on clutch drives. So I think that's what we took from that Colorado game. Now, I think this weekend is going to tell what it really means. So we'll find out come this Saturday.
Got Matt Lowery on the line. You can join him and the rest of the staff there at Conquest Chronicles on SB Nation, covering USC football as the Trojans try to complete a Pac-12 championship run, win the South. They already have a key win under their belts against Utah, but they've got Oregon, maybe the best team that they've faced all season at the Coliseum, which the Trojans have been a different team at home, but find themselves as a 7-point underdog. And again, they're a different team at home, and they've been able to take on any challenge, including Utah, and be the much better team. So that's how much Vegas thinks of these Ducks, even though they needed every second to beat Washington State, who's only 4-4.
Yeah. And I think the thing with Washington State, and we talked about it before we went on the air, watching that game, watching the full game, it makes me confident that USC can move the ball on Oregon. And you mentioned USC is a different team at home. They could take on just about anybody. But you saw Washington State actually move the ball with ease. And now I know a lot of people that look at the stat sheet and they'll go, well, yeah, but Gordon threw 2 interceptions. Well, if you look at how those interceptions happen, then it'll change your perspective. Both of them wasn't like Oregon just all out picked it off or it was a bad throw. It was one of those ball hits the receiver hands. It tips off of the receiver's hands and it's picked off. Realistically, if we look at it, if you turn those around and those turn into Washington State touchdowns, you're looking at a Washington State win over Oregon, but that wasn't the case at all. I think if Graham Harrell plays this right, USC could work their way down the field and could put up points against Oregon. Now, again, USC has to take care of the ball, Oregon is right now. Oregon is one of the top teams in the Pac-12, if not they're the top team in the Pac-12 in interceptions currently with 14 interceptions on the year. So that don't mean oh yeah, all of Oregon's interceptions are a fluke. No, they have 14 interceptions for a reason. So that's still a pretty good secondary.
Yeah, man, it's a situation in which Oregon really had a lockdown defense for much of the season. A lot of that had to do with the schedule being mostly backloaded, although they played a great game defensively against Auburn until the final 5 to 6 minutes of the game. They let up a couple scores. They had a 21-6 lead. They let it slip away with the defensive breakdown in the final 9 seconds in particular. But their defensive metrics across the board nationally were very high up until a couple weeks ago. So it's got to give USC a bit of hope, seeing what they saw, not just against Washington State, but the previous week, Washington jumped out early. Jacob Eason had a ton of success. Oregon did pull it out late again with a couple of scores. 35-31, I believe, was the final. But again, it was a Washington team that probably doesn't have, well, I will say definitely does not have the wide receiver play that USC does, nor does Washington State. And they were able to make big plays in the passing game.
Yeah, they were, and that's what's going to be challenging for Oregon, is that Oregon has not seen the wide receiving core that USC has, nor anything as talented. They've had to cover, they had to face Washington State. Okay, Washington State overall passing game is very good. They had to face a very good quarterback in Jacob Eason, or I think one of the better quarterbacks on Oregon's schedule. But you're covering not just Michael Pittman Jr., who's been outstanding, this season, but you have Tyler Bonds, who's been really good this season. Amon-Ra St. Brown, Bellis Jones, whenever he's used into the equation. You have Drake London, who showed that he can that he's ready for for big time with the play that he had, as well as a couple of tight ends who's also thrown into the mix as well. So Oregon has a lot to deal with. And I know a lot of people will say, well, all Oregon has to do is just drop 8 in the coverage and they're fine. Well, Keenan, or not Keenan, but Keenan Kristen also showed his versatility on Friday night. And he's also a very speedy running back. Not to mention, you might see Stephen Carr. You might see Stephen Carr come back. It kind of depends on his hamstring, but he might be in the equation too as soon as we learn his status.
Troy Dye is one of the better players in the nation on the defensive side of the ball. From the end position, a little outside linebacker, 5.5 tackles for loss. He's got a sack. He's got 38 tackles to lead the Oregon Ducks. Isaac Slade Mataatia, 6 tackles for loss and a sack, as well as, again, the metrics were really high on Oregon for most of their schedule, but they've been picked apart a bit by Washington and Washington State the last few weeks. And again, they've got talent and speed, not a whole lot of depth on defense for this USC game. If we flip sides of the ball, Matt, we can say that maybe Oregon hasn't seen quite the talent at the playmaking position that they're going to see against USC. We can also say that USC is probably not seeing a future NFL starter to the nth degree of a Justin Herbert, who comes in with 21 touchdowns and 1 pick. So the secondary has certainly seen capable passing games with the likes of Utah and Notre Dame and some others, but this is probably the best it's going to get on the schedule, throwing the football downfield.
Yes, it is. This is where I believe the USC secondary will get tested. With Herbert, as you mentioned, he's right now, a lot of scouts have him as one of the top quarterbacks in the upcoming NFL draft class. 21 touchdowns and only threw 1 interception, which that came against Cal in a 17-7 victory. I believe it came in the first quarter against Cal, actually, of that game. But he can really throw the ball quite a bit. this is going to be a different Herbert that they saw from 2016. That year, Herbert, I believe, was a freshman. Though he showed his talent, he wasn't as polished as he is now. Now, the one thing that I will say that many USC fans will fear is the Oregon running game, and that's something. If we and as you saw against Washington State with C.J. Verrell, him gashing Washington State, I believe, for over 250 yards, 257 yards. Considering USC just gave up, I'd say about 170 yards rushing to Tony Jones Jr. And Notre Dame, and gave up 300 yards rushing to Notre Dame. I'd be a little concerned knowing that Oregon is now physical up front, and that relates to the passing game too. But their offensive line is physical, and they can really run the ball. And they don't just have C.J. Verrell, but they also have I believe it's Travis Dye, who might be healthy in time for the USC game, I believe. So there's some playmakers on this Oregon team that the USC defense need to keep an eye on. And considering how they performed against Colorado, that might be a concern. That might be a concern there.
Yeah, you can't always make that direct comparison, but it's worth a look. Certainly, Oregon met Colorado at a time that the Buffs were playing some decent football up until then. They had beat Nebraska. They beat Arizona State by a couple scores. They go up to Oregon. They get shellacked 45-3. Now, since then, the Buffaloes got shellacked by Washington State. Then they turn around and play USC down to the wire. So they're obviously an inconsistent team that doesn't measure up week to week to be a Pac-12 contender. But at the same time, Oregon was able to handle them easily. Of course, USC was not. Different venue, home road has to be taken into consideration. I'm trying to think if we've got any other common opponents between these two right now. Of course, they both played Washington. USC had to go to play the Huskies, lost by a couple scores in Seattle. Oregon struggled early, got down by a couple scores, came back and won late in a nail biter against Washington. And they both played Stanford. That was a 21-6 win for Oregon. And of course, USC blew out Stanford as well, the second game of the season. And that's the resume that we've got right now. We got those three games, and maybe Oregon's played a little bit better against the three opponents, but not substantially. USC has won those games as well, except for the Washington tilt, obviously, in Seattle. So, yeah, it's going to be a difficult challenge because when we think Oregon football, we think speed and spacing people out and so forth. But you hit on something that needs to be underlined, and that's the Oregon offensive line is one of the best in college football. They're fast, they're versatile, they can get out in space, they're athletic linemen, but they're also very, very tough, and they're NFL ready. And Washington, Oregon, they have the best offensive lines in the Pac-12 right now, and that's going to be something USC is going to have to contend with.
Yeah, well, the thing under Mario Cristobal that I admire and watched with Oregon is that he embraces the physical style of football with that offensive line. He embraces the physicality because if you remember through the years, the reputation was that Oregon was not a physical team, that Oregon was more of a finesse team. And I think that that's gone back to when I believe Mike Bellotti was the head coach at Oregon. But a positive thing with USC is that they could be getting two key guys on defense back. Chris Steele, who I believe missed the Colorado game with an injury, he's likely going to return. He's on track to return from what Clay Helton says. And Christian Rector's also on track to return after he missed 2 games with a sprained ankle. And if they can get Christian Rector back, that'll be a huge boost, considering they lost Drake Jackson for, I believe, for a couple of weeks with a high ankle sprain. But now you get Christian Rector back along with whoever you plug on the opposite side of him, whether it's they decide to put Hunter Echoes down as a down defensive end, or if they have anyone else there or Jay Tulafele, they could go either way with it. But getting Rector back, that's huge, and getting Chris Steele back will be huge as well, because recently the USC secondary has been playing so well, and with Rector, I think he generates enough attention to open somebody up. Now, what Pendergast game plan is going to be against Oregon, I don't know. But what a lot of people don't realize is that Pendergast has a good success rate against Oregon. He's done a pretty good job against Oregon in the past. If we remember the Cal game where they had a very good defensive game, I want to say back in 2010, they had a very good defensive game against Oregon where they slowed down Oregon. So it's something with Pendergast and Oregon where he has their number. So it's something to keep an eye on to see what he has in mind.
Got Matt Lowery on the line from Conquest Chronicles. You can join him and the rest of the staff there covering USC football. Get my Week 10 college football predictions in the link below, next to Voice of College Football Community, where I'm hitting a 58% against the spread. The Pac-12 South Division race, man, this is going to be fascinating, Matt. Right now, USC's at 4-1. Utah's at 4-1. People this may have gotten by a few people, but UCLA's at 3-2.
Yeah.
They're 3-5. They've lost all their non-conference games, and they've been long forgotten since like week 2 of September. But they are 3-2, and I don't think anybody reasonably thinks that they can play with the other two teams. But they still have to play the other two. They can knock them off and win the division. So UCLA still in play, but again, I don't think they're playing at that level of football, but they did have a nice win against Arizona State by 10 points at the Rose Bowl this past weekend. So right now, obviously, USC having to head-to-head against Utah. That's huge right now, as both teams are at 4-1 in the division. USC, I know certainly they need to go out there and take care of business, but even if they lose this game, Utah is facing Washington at the same time on the road. Utah loses, USC stays in the same spot as the division tie and having the tiebreaker over Utah. And then, of course, UCLA is the wild card, in which if they could pull off a couple of major upsets, then they win the division and steal the whole thing. And that would just be shocking to all of us. But right now, USC in the driver's seat, they control their own destiny. And even with an Oregon loss, things could still work out. But if they lay down the hammer against Oregon, pull off a slight upset at home, then they're really in good shape to pull out a Pac-12 South Division championship.
Yeah, and that's the wild thing with the South, is that you don't know what could happen in the South. I will say, and this was something that I mentioned on the podcast with Dina, was that if you look at these games here, now we're assuming that Utah loses to Washington, and we're assuming USC loses to Oregon. Okay, you cancel that out. I think the headline, and this is what I believe, I think the game that could decide it right there will be next week, when USC goes to Tempe and plays Arizona State. I think that will be the factor right there, because if USC pulls this win off, let's say USC pulls this win off, Utah loses to Washington. Now you're looking at USC could just push on through to the Pac-12 title game, regardless of a loss, because they'll still have the tiebreaker. And I don't see them beating, I don't see them losing to Cal and UCLA. I don't foresee that. But this could shape up to go USC's way. And if people are very familiar with this, if you remember in 2016, USC lost on the road to Utah early. However, they beat Colorado. Colorado went on to win, I believe, the rest of their games. So did USC. Colorado goes to play for the Pac-12 title game, loses to Washington. Washington got into the college football playoff, and USC ends up in the Rose Bowl. So for Utah fans, that scenario could very well happen for them. However, if let's say USC wins out and Utah wins out, Utah could be rooting for USC to beat Oregon to backdoor their way into the college football playoffs. So it's an interesting scenario that we have going on, not only in the Pac-12 South, but in the Pac-12 in general.
Good stuff out of Matt Lowery from Conquest Chronicles. Join him on SB Nation's platform for USC as the Trojans get set to play a huge game in the Pac-12 South Division in regards to their hopes of winning the division. Obviously, Oregon playing in the North and playing for a whole lot more in terms of a possible college football playoff appearance for them, and they would be the favorite right now. So Justin Herbert in town at the Coliseum. I will be fascinated to see if USC can handle their offense and make some great plays in the passing game themselves against a Ducks defense that's really good, but has shown vulnerable through the air the past couple weeks.